The marble floor was cold enough that Delaney Marsh could feel it through the thin fabric at her knees, and the entire dining room of the Aurelia went silent. She knelt there, among the white tablecloths and the candlelight, in a black uniform still marked with the soup that had splashed across her sleeve. Preston Vale stood over her, his voice loud enough for every guest in the room to hear, ordering her to apologize to each table for lowering the quality of their evening. In the corner, the homeless man she had quietly brought a bowl of hot soup stood frozen, his old bandaged hands trembling. For 6 weeks he had slept outside behind that restaurant. For the whole of that night he had swallowed every insult in silence. Outside, the snow was falling hard. No one in the dining room stood up. Some turned away. Some quietly raised their phones to record. But at table 9, beside the window overlooking the harbor, a man in a black wool sweater slowly set down his knife and fork. Very slowly, very quietly. He had not spoken a single word all evening, and no one in that restaurant, least of all Preston Vale, had any idea who they had just done this in front of. If you believe kindness still matters, and that no one deserves to be humiliated for helping someone who is hungry, please leave a like and share this story. Subscribe to the channel now so you never miss a story about courage and human dignity. And tell us where you're watching from, because compassion can appear anywhere in this world. 12 hours earlier, in the 3rd-floor apartment on Sumner Street, the morning began the way every other morning did. Nell Marsh, 6 years old, climbed onto the chair pushed up against the refrigerator so she could reach the calendar held in place by 4 fruit-shaped magnets. She pulled down a pencil, drew a cross through yesterday's square, then counted aloud the blank squares that were left. 17. 17 more days until her birthday. Delaney stood by the sink, her hands still wet, turned to look at her daughter, and told her that counting it over and over wasn't going to make the day come any sooner. Nell said it would, that her mother didn't know anything. Then the little girl moved on to something more important. She said the box of crayons at Mrs. Corrigan's house had run out of green, and trees had to be green, because you couldn't draw a tree blue, or people would think it was the ocean. Delaney asked, just to be sure, dark green or light green. Nell thought about it for a moment with great seriousness, then said both. And if her mother could buy both, that would be best. Delaney said she'd try. The little girl looked at her with the solemn expression of someone who had just signed a contract, then climbed down from the chair and ran to get her coat. At 6:45, mother and daughter stepped into the hallway. The door to the apartment across from theirs opened before Delaney even had a chance to knock. Mrs. Corrigan stood in the doorway, her white hair neatly tied at the nape of her neck, a kitchen towel still in one hand. She bent down to greet Nell first, the way she always greeted the little girl first, and only then looked up and nodded to Delaney. Nell went inside, took off her shoes by herself and placed them neatly beside the door because Mrs. Corrigan had taught her to do that, then turned back and waved to her mother. Mrs. Corrigan asked what kind of cookies she wanted to make that afternoon. Nell said star-shaped cookies. Mrs. Corrigan told her they had made stars yesterday, and stars the day before that too, and asked whether she ever got tired of them. The little girl said no, then explained with complete certainty that stars were the best shape of all, because they had 5 points, and 5 was a beautiful number. Mrs. Corrigan laughed, said stars it was, and told Delaney not to worry about work, that it was fine if she came home late that evening because she would save her some dinner. Delaney thanked her. She thanked her a little too long, longer than an ordinary thank you required, and Mrs. Corrigan studied her for a moment before simply saying that they were neighbors, and that was what neighbors did. The door closed. From inside came Nell's voice asking whether she had any green crayons, and Mrs. Corrigan's voice saying she'd look in the drawer. Delaney remained in the hallway for a little while longer. The apartment building hallway was cold that morning, and one of the ceiling lights at the far end flickered because the bulb was failing. She slipped a hand into her coat pocket and touched the stack of letters she had brought up from the mailbox the night before. 3 envelopes. She had carried them upstairs, set them on the table, then tucked them back into her coat pocket without opening a single one. Her fingers tightened around the stiff edges of the paper. She knew the names of all 3 senders without having to look. From inside the apartment across the hall came the sound of laughter. Delaney heard it, and the hand inside her pocket slowly relaxed. She pulled up the collar of her coat, walked down the stairs, and stepped out of the building just as the first snowflakes of the day began to fall over Sumner Street. The radio in the corner store was reporting that a snowstorm would sweep into Boston before nightfall. Delaney caught only part of it, pulled up her hood, and started toward the subway station. She still had 3 hours before her shift began, and she intended to use that time to open the 3 letters, somewhere her daughter wouldn't be able to see her face. The employee changing room at Aurelia was at the end of the hallway behind the kitchen, with nothing more than 2 rows of gray-painted metal lockers and a narrow bench. Delaney arrived 40 minutes before her shift. She sat down, took off her hood, brushed the snow from the shoulders of her coat, then pulled out the 3 letters and laid them across her lap. She opened the first one before the others because she knew it was the most important, and she didn't want to put it off any longer. The insurance company had written 3 paragraphs in the kind of language people used when they wanted to say no, without ever having to use the word no. The heart procedure Dr. Halloran had recommended for Nell had been classified as not meeting the current criteria for urgent intervention. She was still on the waiting list. She would still have the surgery, just not now, but when her turn came. And nowhere in that letter did anyone tell Delaney when that turn might be. In the final paragraph, they stated very clearly that if the family wanted Nell scheduled sooner, according to the recommendation of her treating physician, the out-of-pocket cost would be $12,000, and payment would have to be confirmed before the hospital could place her on the surgical schedule. Delaney read the number twice. She worked 6 shifts a week. She knew exactly how much money she brought home in a month, and she knew exactly how many months it would take to save $12,000 if she didn't eat, didn't pay rent, and didn't buy anything for her daughter. She folded the letter. The second one was thinner, printed on pale yellow paper, with the seal of the Suffolk County Housing Court. Her landlord had filed a case. The hearing was scheduled for 24 days from now. Beneath that was a line in bold, reminding her that if the tenant failed to appear, the court would proceed in her absence. Delaney stared at the date for a long time, then realized something that made her chest tighten. The hearing fell exactly 7 days after Nell's birthday. She sat motionless for a while, one hand resting on the paper, thinking about the calendar on the refrigerator and all those empty squares her daughter counted down every morning. The little girl was counting toward one day. Delaney was counting toward another. Then she opened the 3rd letter. She already knew what it said because it was the 9th letter of its kind in 3 years. The Boston City office responsible for emergency services survivor benefits informed her that Ronan Marsh's death benefit claim was still under review. Still, 3 years, and still under review. The reason appeared in the 4th line. And it was still the same reason as before, that his overnight shift on the night in question didn't match the assignment schedule stored in the personnel system, and the case required further verification. Delaney knew exactly why it didn't match. That night hadn't been Ronan's shift. He had traded with a coworker whose wife was about to give birth. He had texted Delaney at 9 o'clock that night to say he was covering for Rourke, that he'd come home when he was done, and that she shouldn't wait up for him. He never came home. And because a single line in the city's computer system hadn't been updated in time, his death had spent 3 years sitting in someone's drawer, waiting to be verified. Delaney folded all 3 letters, stacked them neatly until the edges were perfectly even, then placed them inside her metal locker. She stayed seated for another 30 seconds, both hands resting on her knees, her eyes fixed on the tile floor. She didn't cry. She had learned a long time ago that if you cried in the changing room, your eyes were still red 15 minutes later. And customers noticed, and managers noticed too. She stood, faced the small mirror mounted beside the door, smoothed her hair, and tied it low at the nape of her neck. She pinned her name tag to the chest of her black uniform and straightened it carefully. Then she drew in a breath, opened the door, and stepped out onto the floor. At that exact moment, from the far end of the hallway, Preston Vale's voice rang out, calling for the entire staff to gather before opening. The entire evening staff stood in a single line along the bar. 11 people with their arms at their sides, exactly as Preston Vale had required since his first week there. He walked slowly from one end of the line to the other, stopping in front of each person. He looked at collars. He looked at shoes. He told one young server to hold up both hands, turned them over to inspect his fingernails, then told him to cut them shorter before going out onto the floor. He paused in front of Delaney a moment longer, looked at the name tag she had pinned perfectly straight, then moved on without saying anything. Preston Vale was 43 years old, had been manager of Aurelia for 7 weeks, and in those 7 weeks the staff had counted him using the word image no fewer than 200 times. The image of the restaurant, the image of the team, the image a guest saw in the first 3 seconds after walking through the door. He said people didn't come to Aurelia simply to eat. They came to feel that they belonged somewhere not everyone was allowed to enter, and the responsibility of every person standing there was to make sure that feeling was never broken. He repeated the rule about the rear entrance, saying no outsider was permitted to linger there, not under any circumstances, not even someone known personally by a member of the staff. Then he moved on to the part he always saved for last each evening. He picked up the blue covered inventory ledger, and walked toward the secondary kitchen area, opened the refrigerator where the day's discarded food trays were kept, counted each compartment, then locked it again with a key he carried separately in the pocket of his suit jacket. He came back out, placed the ledger on the stainless steel counter, and signed his name at the bottom of the page. Chef Halverson stood a few steps away, still holding a slicing knife, watching without saying a word. Before Preston arrived, checking the discarded food trays and signing the ledger had been his responsibility. It had been his responsibility for 9 years. During Preston's first week, he had taken the key and said that a new manager meant new procedures, and no one had asked another question because there was no point in asking. The meeting should have ended there. But one of the stockroom employees, the young man responsible for receiving the morning deliveries, raised his hand. He said there was something he had meant to ask about since the previous week. The lobster shipment delivered on Tuesday was listed on the invoice as 42 kilograms, but when he weighed again upon receiving it, there were only 31 kilograms. He had written a note on the invoice and left it on the manager's desk, but when he opened the ledger this week, it still showed 42 kilograms. While the missing amount had been entered under discarded goods, he said it in an ordinary voice, the voice of someone asking for clarification rather than making an accusation. The entire line went silent. Preston Vale didn't turn around immediately. He remained exactly where he was for about 2 seconds, one hand still resting on the cover of the ledger, before finally lifting his head. And when he spoke, his voice had changed. It was louder than necessary for an answer given in an empty room. He asked the young man who he thought he was, opening the inventory ledger. The young employee said he had only been comparing it against the receiving invoice. Preston cut him off and said no one in that line was allowed to touch that ledger. No one was allowed to open it. No one was allowed to compare it against anything. And no one was allowed to add a single word to it. He said someone from corporate would be coming down the following week for an internal audit. Every number would be explained by him, and if anyone wanted to invent a separate version of the books for himself, then that person could also invent his own plan for finding a new job. When he finished, he let out a breath and adjusted his cuff. Then he smiled, the smile of a man who had just realized he had raised his voice, and said more gently that the lobster shipment had already been settled with the supplier, that it was a minor issue, and that everyone should focus on that evening because the forecasted snowstorm meant reservations were completely full beginning at 7 o'clock. The stockroom employee nodded and said nothing more. The line broke apart. Delaney headed toward the dining room, passing the spot where Preston was standing, and she noticed one very small detail that she didn't think much about at the time. He picked up the blue-covered ledger and carried it into the manager's office, instead of leaving it on the stainless steel counter, the way he did every other night. At 7 o'clock that evening, every table in Aurelia's dining room was occupied except one. Table number 9 sat beside the window overlooking the harbor, the finest seat in the entire restaurant, and every Thursday evening it remained empty until the person who sat there walked through the door. In the reservation system, the note beside table number 9 contained only a single sentence: hold by order of corporate headquarters. Do not ask why. Preston Vale had emailed the corporate office 3 times, asking to have that standing hold removed. The first time, he wrote very politely, explaining that table number 9 generated more revenue than any other table, and that keeping it empty every Thursday evening hurt the branch's performance targets. No one replied. The second time, he attached a spreadsheet comparing average revenue by table location and underlined the difference in red. He received a reply containing exactly 7 words. Keep the current arrangement unchanged. No exceptions. The third time, he asked directly whose guest it was. That time, he didn't even receive a response. 7 weeks, 3 refusals, not a single explanation, and every Thursday evening the best table in his restaurant sat there like a reminder that there were things he wasn't permitted to know. At 7:15, the door opened. 2 men came inside, brushing snow from their shoulders. The man in front was tall and broad-shouldered, with neatly cut black hair, wearing a black collarless sweater. No tie, no watch, only a plain silver ring on his ring finger. Along the left side of his jaw was a faint scar, so old that you had to stand close to notice it. The man behind him was half a head shorter, somewhere in his 30s, silent, carrying a slim leather briefcase that he set on the floor the moment he sat down. The host greeted them without asking for a name, merely nodded, and led them straight to table number 9. In that evening's reservation book, the table was listed under the name Doyle. The man in the black sweater sat in the chair facing the entrance, exactly as he did every Thursday. He didn't look at the menu. He ordered pan-seared cod and a glass of water. The other man ordered exactly the same thing. No wine, no appetizer, no dessert. And every Thursday evening their bill was the lowest in the entire dining room. Preston Vale stood at the host stand watching them, then turned to the young host and said loudly enough for 2 or 3 people nearby to hear that the Thursday guest was back, and told him to make sure he was looked after properly so corporate wouldn't send another reminder. He said the words, Thursday guest, in the way people used a nickname they had invented for themselves, something that made them feel more comfortable about what they didn't understand. The young host gave an uneasy smile and said nothing. Preston looked toward table number 9 for another moment. The man in the black sweater sat very still, both hands resting on the table, his eyes turned toward the window where snow was striking the glass. He didn't talk. He didn't use his phone. In all 7 weeks Preston had worked there, he had never seen the man order anything extra, never seen him complain, and never heard him say more than 5 sentences. In Preston's mind, he was simply a strange customer, taking up the best seat without spending money, protected by someone at corporate for some ridiculous reason, and nothing more. He turned away, tucked the blue-covered ledger beneath his arm, and headed toward the manager's office. Delaney passed table number 9, carrying a tray at 7:20. She set down 2 glasses of water. The man in the black sweater said thank you, and she said you're welcome before continuing on her way. That was the entirety of the first conversation the 2 of them ever had. At 7:45, Delaney carried 2 bags of trash out through the back door. The wind in the alley struck her full in the face. Snow had already covered the steps, and she nearly lost her footing. She lifted the lid of the dumpster, tossed the bags inside, and only then noticed someone sitting in the corner to the right, directly beneath the narrow awning that was barely wide enough for a single step. The man sat curled in on himself, his back against the brick wall, his head lowered. He heard the dumpster lid and looked up. Then he did something that made Delaney stop. He planted his hands on the concrete, rose very slowly and with obvious difficulty, then stepped out from beneath the awning, into the place where the snow was falling directly on him, and apologized. He said he was blocking the entrance, that he hadn't realized it, and that he was sorry. He said he was only trying to get out of the wind for a little while, and would leave right away. Delaney stood there with the dumpster lid still in her hand, and didn't know what to say for the first 3 seconds. She had worked in this neighborhood long enough to encounter plenty of people sleeping on the streets. Some asked for money, some asked for food, some cursed at her, but no one had ever apologized to her for sitting beneath an awning to escape the weather. She told him to get back under the shelter because he was going to get soaked standing out there. He didn't move. She said it again, this time in a more ordinary voice, telling him the awning didn't belong to anyone and he wasn't blocking anything. Only then did he step back beneath it, still keeping his distance from the door. In the yellow light spilling from the small window in the wall, Delaney saw his hands. They were wrapped in cloth bandages, old bandages that had faded with age, but the way they were wrapped was strange. It wasn't the kind of hurried wrapping someone used simply to keep warm. The cloth circled each wrist twice, crossed over the back of the hand, threaded between the fingers, neat and firm, perfectly even on both sides. Delaney didn't know what that kind of wrapping was called, but she knew one thing with certainty. Whoever had wrapped those hands had done it thousands of times in his life. She asked if there was something wrong with his hands. He said no. His hands were fine. It was only an old habit, and wrapping them helped keep the joints from getting stiff. Then he added, as though to reassure her, that he wasn't drunk, he hadn't taken anything, and he was only waiting for the worst of the wind to pass. Delaney asked his name. He hesitated for a moment, as though it had been a long time since anyone had asked him that question. Emmett Shaw. She told him her name was Delaney. He nodded and said it was a pleasure to meet her, in the voice of a man who had once been accustomed to shaking other people's hands. She asked if he lived around there. Emmett said he stayed here and there for the time being. Then he looked toward the far end of the alley, where the snow was sweeping through the streetlight in long streaks, and said that he used to have a place on Bowdoin Street, a small boxing gym on the ground floor. He had taught neighborhood kids there for more than 20 years. All children from families who had nothing, he said. The kind of kids who, if they had nowhere to go that afternoon, would end up somewhere else that night, and that somewhere else usually wasn't good. Delaney asked what had happened to the gym. Emmett gave a short laugh with no joy in it. He said the city had sealed it 10 years earlier because of unpaid taxes. He couldn't afford to pay them. Contributions from the parents came and went, and one morning people showed up and nailed the door shut right in front of him. He said he had stood there looking at it for quite a while. Then he raised a hand to his chest and touched the inside pocket of his coat, exactly the gesture of someone checking to make sure something was still where it belonged. Delaney noticed the movement. He realized she had noticed, and lowered his hand. He said he still kept some of the papers for the building. They weren't good for anything, he said. The tax debt was worth more than the property. No one wanted to buy anything in Dorchester back then, and he supposed it was probably still the same now. He kept them only because he was used to carrying them. He said it calmly, in the voice of a man who had solved that equation a long time ago and had no intention of solving it again. Delaney was about to ask something else when the wind shifted, driving snow against the door. And from inside the restaurant came the bell signaling that an order was ready. She said she had to go back inside. Emmett nodded, told her to go ahead, and thanked her for talking to him. He thanked her for something Delaney didn't think she had done at all. She closed the door. 3 steps down the hallway, she stopped and turned back toward the small glass window in the wall. Outside, he had already sat down in the same place again, his bandaged hands tucked inside his coat, his head lowered against the wind. At 9:20, the snowstorm swept into Boston exactly as the radio had predicted. The wind shifted, blowing inland from the harbor, and within half an hour, the temperature outside dropped below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the dining room, people were still eating dessert by candlelight. Delaney went on her break at 9:30. She walked into the secondary kitchen area, where Chef Halverson had just finished separating the food that could no longer be served that evening. These were dishes guests had ordered, and then changed their minds about. Portions prepared in excess when tables canceled at the last minute, food that had already left the kitchen and, under restaurant policy, couldn't be served again. They went into the discard trays, and at the end of the shift they would be thrown away. Delaney knew the procedure well. She had watched it repeat itself every night for 2 years. She took a paper container and ladled in a serving of oyster soup that was still hot, added 2 slices of bread, then a portion of pan-seared beef that was completely untouched, and closed the lid. She poured a cup of black coffee and covered it with a plastic lid. She worked quickly and made no effort to hide what she was doing, because employees often ate food from the discard trays or took it home, and that was normal in every restaurant. Carrying the box of food and the cup of coffee, she went to the back door, intending to hand them to him and come straight back inside. She had opened the door barely the width of her hand when the wind tore it from her grip and slammed it against the wall, while snow struck her face sideways like a fistful of wet sand. She had to use her shoulder to force the door closed again. Coffee spilled over her hand. She stood in the hallway breathing and realized that if she took the food outside, it would be lukewarm within 5 minutes, and within 10, it would be colder than the air itself. She stepped 3 paces to the side, toward the small glass window set into the sidewall, and looked out. Emmett Shaw was still sitting in the corner beneath the awning. Snow had settled across his shoulders in a white layer he hadn't brushed away. He sat bent slightly forward, his bandaged hands tucked inside his coat and pinned beneath his arms, the posture of someone trying to hold on to the last bit of warmth left in his body. He didn't look toward the window. He didn't knock on the door. He didn't do anything at all. He simply sat there waiting for the wind to stop. And tonight the wind wasn't going to stop. Delaney watched him for about 5 seconds. In those 5 seconds, she thought about the rule Preston had repeated at the staff meeting that evening, that no outsider was permitted to linger near the back entrance, not under any circumstances. She thought about the name tag she had pinned to her uniform. She thought about the 3 letters lying in her metal locker 30 steps away. And she thought that she was the person in that building who could least afford to risk her job. Then she thought about something else. She thought about the woman who had opened the apartment door across the hall that morning before Delaney even had a chance to knock, and who had bent down to greet her daughter before greeting her. Delaney opened the door. She had to use both hands and one shoulder to keep the wind from ripping it away from her. She called his name. Emmett looked up, and it took him a moment to understand what was happening. She told him to come inside. He shook his head and said he couldn't, that he wasn't going inside. She said 15 minutes. Just 15 minutes. He remained seated. She said it again, this time more sharply because of the wind, telling him to come in, eat something hot, then go back out. 15 minutes. And if he didn't come inside, she was going to stand there holding the door open all night. Emmett Shaw planted his hands against the ground, stood up, brushed the snow from his shoulders, and stepped inside. Before crossing the threshold, he stopped, bent down, and carefully wiped both soles of his shoes against the doormat, rubbing them far longer than necessary before taking another step. Delaney closed the door. She led him down the rear hallway, avoiding the main kitchen, then took him around to the far end of the dining room, where a small table for 2 stood hidden behind a wood-paneled column. The table had no number. It wasn't shown on the reservation chart. Employees usually sat there folding napkins when business was slow. From that spot, A person could see only a small corner of the dining room, and from the dining room looking back, the column concealed nearly all of it. Delaney pulled out a chair and told him to sit down. She placed the food container on the table, opened the lid, and the scent of hot oyster soup rose into the cool air. She said she'd be right back, then went to get a clean set of silverware and a cloth napkin, because she thought that if you were going to give someone a meal, you shouldn't make them eat it with their hands. Emmett Shaw sat down in that chair the way a person sits somewhere he knows doesn't belong to him. He perched on the edge of the seat, his back straight, his legs held close together. And before placing his hands on the table, he pulled the sleeves of his coat down over his damp wrists so he wouldn't get the tablecloth wet. Delaney set the silverware and the cloth napkin in front of him. He looked at them, then at the plate of food, and he didn't move. He sat that way for quite a while, long enough that Delaney finally had to ask whether there was something about the food he didn't like. Emmett shook his head. He said no, that wasn't it. Then he said, more quietly, that it had been a long time since anyone had set a place for him with silverware. He picked up the napkin, unfolded it, laid it neatly across his lap, and only then did he take up the spoon. He ate slowly. He didn't slurp, didn't make a sound, and every few spoonfuls he would set the spoon carefully against the edge of the bowl before lifting it again. Delaney stood a few steps away, pretending to straighten the stack of napkins on a shelf, and she realized she was watching those bandaged hands hold the silver spoon with extraordinary care, as though he were afraid he might bend it. He thanked her the first time when she set the coffee down, the second time when she refilled it. The third time wasn't for anything in particular at all. He simply looked up in the middle of the meal and thanked her, and Delaney had to turn her face away for a second. She asked him about the children at the gym, partly to keep him talking so he would stay warm, and partly because she genuinely wanted to know. Emmett told her. He said that on the busiest afternoons there could be as many as 30 kids in there, even though the gym had only 2 heavy bags and 1 old mat. He said he never turned a child away for not paying, because any kid who had money probably wouldn't have needed a place like his in the first place. He had a large pot that he used to cook noodles every afternoon, and he told the kids that if they finished training, they could eat, and if they didn't train, they could still eat, as long as they sat down and ate properly. He said that pot cost him more than the electricity did. Then he told her about the morning they nailed the door shut. He said they came at 7 o'clock, 3 people, all the paperwork in order, and they were very polite about it. He stood across the street and watched. He said the hard part wasn't losing the gym. The hard part was that several of the kids still came by that afternoon, stood in front of the door, looked at the boards nailed across it, and then turned around and walked away. He said he remembered the face of every single one of them as they turned away. When he reached that part, he stopped, took a sip of coffee, and didn't continue. Some 23 to 26 feet away, at table number 9 beside the window, the man in the black sweater stopped chewing. He didn't turn all the way around. He merely tilted his head slightly, just enough to see through the narrow gap between the wood-paneled column and the edge of the wall. From that angle, the only things he could see were part of an arm and 2 hands holding a cup of coffee. 2 hands wrapped in cloth bandages, circling the wrists twice, crossing over the backs of the hands, threading between the fingers. Cormac Devlin stared at those hands for a long time. He stared long enough that Fintan Doyle looked up and asked if something was wrong. Cormac didn't answer the question. Instead, in an ordinary voice, he asked what the name of the man sitting behind the column was. Fintan turned his head to look, then said he didn't know. Probably a guest. Cormac said he wasn't a guest. Fintan asked who he was then. Cormac didn't answer. He picked up his fork, cut off a piece of fish, and continued eating. But for the next 20 minutes, Fintan noticed that his boss chewed very slowly and never took his eyes off the narrow gap between the column and the wall. At one point, Cormac asked Fintan to check the time for him. Fintan said it was 10 minutes to 10. Cormac nodded and said nothing more. Somewhere in his mind, something was trying to rise from a place very deep inside him, something he hadn't thought about in more than 20 years, and it still wasn't clear enough for him to give it a name. He knew only one thing for certain. There weren't many people left in the world who wrapped their hands that way anymore, and the man who had taught him how to do it had disappeared from the city of Boston a very long time ago. At 5 minutes to 10, Preston Vale came out onto the dining room floor, from the hallway leading to the manager's office, the blue-covered ledger in his hand. He had taken 4 steps when he stopped. From where he stood, the wood-paneled column no longer blocked his view, and he could see straight toward the small table behind it. An old man in a wet coat was sitting there eating, a cloth napkin spread across his lap, a set of silverware resting beside his plate. Preston's face went pale, but his eyes didn't stop on the old man's face. And they didn't stop on the bandages wrapped around his hands. His gaze passed over him and fixed on the open paper container sitting on the table, then moved beyond it toward the hallway leading into the secondary kitchen area, toward the refrigerator he had opened and counted through for the second time 40 minutes earlier. He stood completely still for 2 seconds, then he walked straight toward them. He asked who had let this man inside. He didn't raise his voice, but the 3 nearest tables were only a few yards away, and in a dining room that had grown quieter beneath the weight of the snowstorm outside, his voice carried a long way. Emmett set down his spoon. Delaney was standing beside the napkin shelf. She stepped forward. She said she had let him in. She said it was below freezing outside. The snowstorm would last at least another 2 hours, and the food he was eating had come from the discard tray and would have been thrown away at the end of the shift anyway. She said she had told him 15 minutes, and those 15 minutes were almost over. Preston didn't look at her. He looked at Emmett and ordered him to leave the restaurant immediately. Emmett Shaw stood up. He did it faster than he had risen at any other point that evening, and he did it without showing even the slightest trace of offense. He folded the cloth napkin, placed it along the edge of the table, and pushed his chair neatly back underneath. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't meant to cause trouble for anyone, that she had only let him inside because she was kind, and that he shouldn't have accepted her offer in the first place. He said he would leave right away. Delaney said she would pay for the meal. She said she knew the rules, she had broken them, and she would pay the full menu price for the soup, the bread, and the beef, and Preston could deduct it directly from her next paycheck. She said it in a calm voice, her arms still at her sides, exactly the posture he had taught them during the staff meeting. That should have been the end of it. If Preston Vale had accepted that offer, he would have won. He would have upheld the rule, preserved his authority, and moved on. But at the 3 nearest tables, people had already turned to watch. A man at table number 4 had stopped eating, leaned back in his chair, folded his arms, and waited to see what would happen. 2 women at table number 6 had stopped talking. Preston could feel more than 30 pairs of eyes in the room waiting to see how he would handle it, and in those 2 seconds, something inside him slipped out of place. He turned toward Delaney. He asked her where she thought she was working. Before she could answer, he went on, saying that guests paid $180 for a meal at Aurelia, so they wouldn't have to look at something like this, that she had just turned the restaurant into a charity kitchen, and that she had made the entire place look cheap. He told her she was fired effective that night. Delaney stood still. She didn't argue. She lifted a hand to her chest and removed her name tag. Her fingers were trembling, and the clasp caught in the fabric, so she had to try twice before she could free it, while the entire dining room watched her in silence. She placed the name tag on the small table beside the napkin Emmett had just folded. That should have been the end of it, but Preston Vale added one more sentence. He said, "And I'm going to record every bit of it in tonight's ledger. Every single item." Delaney looked up. She didn't understand. The only thought in her mind was a simple one, that he really intended to charge her for the food, and she had already offered to pay for it. She didn't know what the blue-covered ledger tucked beneath his arm was. She didn't know that 40 minutes earlier he had stood in front of that refrigerator counting and recounting everything inside. She didn't know that for the past 7 weeks, the discarded goods section of that ledger had been the only place in the world where he could hide the difference between the amount of inventory he claimed had been delivered and the amount that had actually entered the stockroom. And she had absolutely no idea that the corporation's internal auditors would be coming to Aurelia 6 days from now. She only heard the sentence, thought it sounded strange, and then let it go. She bent down to pick up her coat. Emmett Shaw had already taken 3 steps toward the hallway leading to the back door. Then he stopped. He turned around. Delaney told him quietly to go, that it was all right. Emmett didn't move. He looked at Preston Vale and said, in the voice of a 71-year-old man who had lived long enough to know exactly what he was saying, that she hadn't done anything wrong. Preston turned toward him, and at table number 9 beside the window, the man in the black sweater placed both hands on the tabletop. To understand why Preston Vale said that final sentence, you have to go back 3 minutes earlier, when he was still standing alone in the manager's office with the door left slightly ajar. On the desk lay the blue-covered ledger, open to that evening's page. Beside it was the small key he carried separately in the pocket of his suit jacket. 40 minutes earlier, he had gone out to the secondary kitchen area, unlocked the refrigerator that held the discard trays, and counted everything inside. Then he returned to the office, compared the contents with what had already been entered in the ledger, and counted it all a second time with the tip of his pen. 7 weeks earlier, when Preston Vale took over as manager of Aurelia, the first thing he did wasn't change the menu or tighten the rules on staff uniforms. The first thing he did was take the discard refrigerator key away from Chef Halverson and claim sole authority over signing the inventory ledger. No one questioned it because on paper that responsibility belonged to the manager, and because for the previous 9 years, the chef had only handled it because the former manager had been too lazy to bother. But the inventory ledger of an upscale seafood restaurant was a very particular kind of thing. It was the only place in the entire system where a number could disappear without anyone going looking for it. His method was so simple that sometimes he had found it almost amusing that no one had thought of it sooner. He signed receiving invoices for quantities greater than what was actually delivered. 42 kilograms of lobster on the invoice, 31 kilograms entering the stockroom. The missing 11 kilograms didn't exist inside the kitchen, but they existed on paper. And anything that existed on paper eventually had to be accounted for somewhere. He accounted for it under discarded goods. Product damaged in transit. Product rejected during preparation. Meals returned by guests. A few lines every evening. A few $100s on each line. And by the end of the month, it became enough money to cover the loan on the apartment he had bought in the South End. The kind of apartment a restaurant manager's salary could never have afforded. The real product never reached Aurelia's doors at all. The delivery truck stopped at a location on Northern Avenue, where a man from the fish market took possession of the missing portion for cash. No receipt, no name, twice a week. For 7 weeks, everything ran smoothly. Then, 10 days earlier, a notice arrived from the corporate office announcing the routine internal audit for the Seaport branch. 6 days from now, people from Ashgrove would come down carrying copies of the supplier's receiving records, and they would place those records beside this blue-covered ledger. From the night Preston received that notice, he went out and counted the discard trays twice every evening, because his entire story depended on one thing being true, that the amount of food sitting in the discard trays each night had to match exactly what he had written down. If it matched, he had a system. If it didn't, he had a crime. Tonight, it didn't match. 4 items. 1 serving of oyster soup, 2 slices of bread, 1 untouched portion of pan-seared beef, and the paper container he had counted at 9 o'clock. 4 items that weren't in the discard tray, weren't on any customer's table, and weren't anywhere the ledger could explain. Preston stood staring at that column of numbers for quite a while. He knew 4 items weren't the problem. 4 items weren't worth much money. The problem was that 6 days from now, someone would sit down at this desk with a stack of documents and ask why the discarded goods total at the Seaport branch was 3 times higher than the average across the entire company. When that happened, he would need an answer. And the best answer, the kind of answer every auditor in the world would believe immediately, was that an employee in this restaurant had been taking food from the discard trays. There would be a written record. There would be witnesses. There would be dates and times. There would be one person whose name could be attached to every unexplained discrepancy from the previous 7 weeks. He needed a name. He closed the ledger, tucked it beneath his arm, adjusted his cuff, and walked out onto the dining room floor with only one intention: to find out who had touched his refrigerator that night. He took 4 steps, and at the far end of the dining room, behind the wood-paneled column, he saw Delaney Marsh tipping a coffee pot to refill the cup of an old man in a wet coat, his hands wrapped in cloth bandages, eating with the restaurant's silverware. Preston Vale stood completely still for 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, his face didn't go pale because he was afraid. His face went pale because he had just seen exactly what he needed, laid out in front of him in the middle of a dining room full of witnesses. Delaney draped her coat over one arm, gave Emmett the slightest nod, and turned toward the hallway. She took exactly 2 steps. Preston Vale moved in front of her. He didn't touch her, didn't raise a hand to stop her. He simply stepped sideways and placed himself between her and the door. Then he did 2 things at once. With his left hand, he reached toward the small table, picked up the empty stainless steel tray Delaney had used to carry out the box of food, and held it at chest level, turning its flat surface toward the dining room the way someone might display a piece of evidence. With his right hand, he pulled his phone from the pocket of his suit jacket, pressed 3 numbers, and held the screen up so she could see it. The 3 numbers were clearly visible against the bright display. His thumb rested on the call button and didn't move. Preston spoke in an even voice, the kind of calm voice that was more frightening than shouting. He said she had just removed restaurant property from a controlled area, that it was documented in the ledger, that there were witnesses, and that there was a date and a time. He said if she walked through that door, he would press the button. The police would be there within 10 minutes. They would file a report, and her name would go into a record she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Then he lowered his voice even further. He said that if, instead, she got down on her knees, right there, and apologize to every table in the dining room for ruining their evening. He would erase those 3 numbers, and tonight would be nothing more than an employee leaving her job. The entire dining room went silent. Somewhere, a knife touched a plate, and then even that sound disappeared. Delaney stood there with her coat over one arm, and for about 5 seconds, her mind began doing a calculation. She thought about the second letter lying in the metal locker 30 steps away. The pale yellow sheet bearing the seal of the Suffolk County Housing Court, the hearing scheduled 24 days from now. She had spoken with a free legal aid attorney at the community center, and they had told her that her only real chance was to prove that she was a responsible tenant, steadily employed, with no trouble attached to her name. She thought about the first letter, and about the call the previous week from the pediatric cardiology program coordinator, the woman with the kind voice who had explained that in order for Nell to be scheduled for an earlier procedure, besides the out-of-pocket cost, the file would also require confirmation that the family had stable housing after discharge because the child would need to be monitored at home during recovery. She thought about where an accusation of stealing property, whether true or false, would end up, and exactly which people would read it. She thought about having to apply for another job the next morning, and about how the first question on every service industry application was always the same. And finally, she thought about a calendar stuck to the refrigerator door, with 4 fruit-shaped magnets, and a 6-year-old girl climbing onto a chair every morning to cross off another square. 17 days left. Delaney Marsh raised her eyes and looked at Preston Vale. She asked him only one question, very softly, almost too quietly to hear. She asked whether he would really erase the numbers if she did it. Preston didn't answer. He simply kept his thumb resting on the call button. Behind her, Emmett Shaw stepped forward and said, "Don't." He told Preston that he would pay for the food, that he would tell the police he was the one who had taken it, that he would take the blame for everything. Preston glanced at him and told him to shut up, then said the statement of a man who slept on the street wouldn't be worth anything in a police report. The words made Emmett freeze, not because they offended him, but because he knew they were true. Delaney turned to look at him. She told him not to say anything else. She said it in the voice of someone protecting another person, not the voice of someone who needed protection herself. Then she placed her coat on the chair. She did it carefully, folding it in half and laying it over the back so it wouldn't fall to the floor. She reached behind her neck and tightened the tie around her hair. No one in the dining room said a word. At table number 9 beside the window, the man in the black sweater still had both hands resting on the tabletop, and his eyes hadn't left her. Delaney stepped out from the shadow behind the wood-paneled column. She walked past table number 4, where the man with folded arms was watching. She walked past table number 6, where the 2 women had set down their forks long ago. She continued into the open space at the center of the dining room, where candlelight from every table spilled across the floor and the polished granite gleamed beneath her feet. Then she stopped and turned to face the people who were sitting there eating. By the 4th table, her voice had gone hoarse. Delaney said the apology for the 4th time, and she said it more slowly than the first 3, because there was no longer enough breath in her chest to push the whole sentence out at once. The couple sitting at that table looked down at the tabletop. The husband gave the slightest nod, and it was impossible to tell whether he was accepting her apology or simply wanted her to move on as quickly as possible. Preston Vale stood 3 steps away, still holding the stainless steel tray, and he told her to speak louder. He said the tables at the far end of the room couldn't hear her. Delaney moved on her knees toward the 5th table. Across the granite floor, the distance between 2 tables felt longer than she had imagined. She said it again. At the 5th table, a middle-aged man lifted one hand in a dismissive gesture, told her that was enough, and turned his face away. She finished the apology to the back of his head because she didn't dare stop halfway while Preston was still holding the phone. The 6th table belonged to the 2 women. The woman sitting on the outside pushed her chair back half an inch, the movement of someone about to stand, and everyone at the surrounding tables looked up at her. She remained seated. She placed both hands in her lap, lowered her eyes, and didn't stand after all. Delaney finished her sentence and moved to the next table. No one in that dining room that night knew that the woman would remember that half inch for many years afterward. Then came the sound of footsteps on the stone floor, not the sound of Preston's leather shoes. This was the dragging sound of wet shoes that had been walking for far too long, slow and heavy, with a slight limp in the left leg. The entire dining room turned to look. Emmett Shaw walked out from behind the wood-paneled column and into the center of the room. He crossed the entire distance without anyone stopping him, because no one understood what he intended to do. He came to Delaney's side. He stood there for 1 second, reached out to grip the edge of the nearest table for support, then lowered himself down. It was very difficult for him. His right knee touched the floor first. Then he had to shift his hand, and only then did his left knee come down beside it, while a long breath escaped through his clenched teeth. He knelt beside her on the same stone floor, beneath the same candlelight. Delaney turned toward him and whispered, asking what he was doing, telling him to get up. Emmett didn't look at her. He raised his head and looked at Preston Vale, and in a voice loud enough for everyone in the dining room to hear every word, he said that if anyone in this place had to kneel, it should be him. He said he was the one who had walked through that door. He was the one who had sat in that chair. He was the one who had eaten that meal. Then he turned toward Delaney, and his voice changed completely. It dropped lower, grew warmer, and it was no longer the voice of a man arguing with a restaurant manager. It was the voice of someone who had said this same sentence several thousand times, in a room with 2 heavy bags and an old mat. He told her to get up. He said nobody ever learned anything while they were lying on the floor. At table number 9, beside the window overlooking the harbor, the man in the black sweater snapped his head up. Fintan Doyle, sitting across from him, saw it clearly and had no idea what was happening because in 7 weeks of dining with this man, he had never once seen him react that quickly to anything. Cormac Devlin hadn't heard the dragging footsteps across the stone floor. He couldn't see the old man's face because the column and the people standing nearby blocked his view, but he heard that sentence. He heard it. And somewhere inside his mind, a door flew open after being sealed shut for 24 years. An afternoon in February of 2002. A ground-floor room on Bowden Street. The smell of sweat and hot oil. The glass door clouded with steam. A 10-year-old boy had been punched to the mat and lay flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling, refusing to get up, because getting up meant admitting he had fallen, and a bandaged hand reached down in front of him. The same voice. The same words. Nobody ever learned anything while they were lying on the floor. Cormac Devlin slowly lowered his eyes to the 2 hands resting on the white tablecloth in front of him. Then he looked up toward the center of the dining room, where 2 people were kneeling on the granite floor. Cormac Devlin set down his knife and fork. Very slowly, very quietly, they touched the edge of the plate with almost no sound at all. And that was the last gentle sound anyone heard that evening. Then he pushed his chair back and stood. The wooden legs scraped across the granite floor. A long, dry, sharp sound that carried from one end of the dining room to the other. The entire room turned. Fintan Doyle placed a hand on the edge of the table, about to rise with him. But Cormac extended 2 fingers slightly, and Fintan sat back down. The man in the black sweater walked from table number 9 toward the center of the dining room. He didn't hurry. He moved with the measured pace of someone who knew with absolute certainty that nothing in that room was going to happen before he reached where he was going. Preston Vale saw him approaching, and for the first 2 seconds his professional reflex took over. He arranged his mouth into the polite smile reserved for customers, and began apologizing for the inconvenience. Cormac walked past him, as though he were walking past a pillar. He didn't look at him. He didn't say a single word to him. The smile on Preston's face died halfway through, and the hand holding his phone lowered halfway before stopping there. Cormac stopped in front of Delaney Marsh. He said nothing. He reached up, pulled the black sweater over his head, folded it once, then bent down and draped it around her shoulders. The sweater was still warm. Delaney flinched more from that warmth than from the gesture itself. She looked up at him, her eyes red, her face still wet, and there wasn't a single clear thought in her mind except that this was the man from table number 9, the customer whose table she had set 2 glasses of water on at 7:20 that evening. Cormac held out his hand. His palm faced upward, open. Not taking hers, but waiting for her to place her hand into it. He waited exactly 3 seconds. Then Delaney reached out, and he helped her to her feet. She managed to stand, but her legs were trembling, and he kept his hand there until she was completely steady. From the moment he had risen until then, he hadn't spoken a word. After that, he turned toward the man who was still kneeling on the stone floor. He didn't crouch down immediately. He stood looking at the cloth-wrapped hands braced against the cold stone, looking at the way the fabric circled the wrists twice and crossed over the backs of the hands, and the entire room watched him staring at them. Then he lowered himself onto one knee until his face was level with the old man's, and he called out 2 words, spoken in the voice of a 34-year-old man, hearing something again that he hadn't heard in 24 years. Coach Shaw. Emmett Shaw looked up. He stared directly into the face of the man kneeling in front of him. He looked at the faint scar along the left side of his jaw, the very scar Emmett himself had covered with cotton and medical tape one afternoon in March of 2002, after a 10-year-old boy came back from school with a cut on his face and refused to say who had done it. He looked at that scar for a long time. And the people standing closest in the dining room would later say that in that moment, the old man's eyes lit up, truly lit up, as though someone had switched on a lamp somewhere behind them. Then the light went out. Emmett Shaw shook his head. He said, "You've got the wrong man." He said it calmly and clearly, without stumbling over a single word. He pulled both hands away from the stone floor, braced them on his knees, and stood up by himself without taking any of the hands offered to him. Cormac Devlin remained on one knee, looking up at him, and for those 3 seconds his face failed to hold the thing it had held without effort through 7 weeks of sitting at table number 9. Fintan Doyle, who had worked with him for 9 years, sat behind him and saw it. He had never seen his boss look like that before. Cormac stood. He didn't ask again. He didn't follow him. He simply looked at the old man turning away and said, quietly enough that only 3 people in the room could hear him, that his pot of noodles still needed more salt. Emmett Shaw froze in the middle of the dining room. He didn't turn around, but his shoulders had begun to shake. And at that exact moment, near the front entrance, Preston Vale finally found his voice again and called for security. The 2 security guards from the hotel lobby entered the dining room in less than a minute. Preston Vale pointed and said all 3 of them, "Out, right now," and added that if anyone resisted, they should call the police as well. The 2 guards looked at each other. One of them seemed hesitant when he saw the man in the black shirt standing in the middle of the room, but the other had already stepped forward, and in their line of work, an order from the restaurant manager was something they were expected to follow. Cormac Devlin didn't resist. He didn't argue either. He simply turned and looked once at Fintan Doyle, and Fintan stood up, leaving behind 2 half-eaten plates of cod, picked up the leather briefcase from the floor, and followed. Cormac held one hand behind Emmett Shaw's back without touching him, merely guiding him toward the door. Delaney picked up her own coat from the back of the chair, still keeping the black sweater around her shoulders, and walked out. The entire dining room watched the 4 of them pass between the tables covered in white linen. The glass door closed behind them. Outside, the wind along the seaport sidewalk cut sideways, and the snow had already risen to their ankles. Delaney stood there for a few seconds and felt something very strange. Not fear, not anger, just the hollow feeling of someone who had just lost her job, lost her dignity, and realized that the only person in the entire room who had dared to stand beside her had just been thrown out into the street with her. She thought about having to walk to the subway station through the snowstorm, and she thought about what she was going to tell Mrs. Corrigan tomorrow. Then came the sound of a car door opening. A black car was parked tight against the curb directly in front of the restaurant, in a place where no one was supposed to be allowed to park. Cormac opened the rear door, held it for them, and told the 2 of them to get inside out of the snow. Emmett shook his head and said he wasn't getting in. Cormac said it was 25 degrees outside. Emmett still didn't move. Cormac continued in an ordinary voice, saying that if Emmett didn't get in, then he would stand out there too, and then there would be 2 old men freezing in the street, except only one of them was actually old. Emmett looked at him for a moment, then climbed into the car. Delaney got in after him. Cormac took the front passenger seat, turned to Fintan, and told him to call Rosalind Pike. Fintan said it was 10:15 at night. Cormac said call her anyway, and tell her he was waiting right there in front of Aurelia, and would remain there until she arrived. Fintan made the call. The person on the other end answered after 3 rings. Fintan said exactly 3 sentences, then hung up. After that, no one spoke. The car didn't start moving. Cormac didn't tell the driver to turn on the heat, didn't tell him to circle the block to keep warm, and didn't move so much as a yard from that spot. He sat still, looking through the windshield as snow slowly gathered across the glass in a hazy layer. 18 minutes passed that way. During those 18 minutes, Delaney Marsh sat in the back seat with the black sweater still around her shoulders, and she began to tremble. Not from the cold, but because everything that had just happened was only now reaching the place inside her, where it was supposed to land. She clasped her hands tightly together. Emmett Shaw sat beside her, staring straight out the window, and didn't say a single word for the entire 18 minutes. He didn't look toward the front seat even once. Finally, Delaney spoke. She asked who Cormac was. He didn't turn around. He didn't answer the question. Instead, he asked her something else. He asked whether she had a child. Delaney went silent for a moment, then asked how he knew. Cormac Devlin looked out into the falling snow ahead, and said it was because she had knelt. He said people with nothing left to lose didn't kneel. People only knelt when there was still something at home waiting for them. Delaney couldn't answer. She sat there in silence, and her tears fell onto the black sweater around her shoulders, and she let them fall because her hands were busy holding tightly to each other. In the seat beside her, Emmett Shaw kept staring out through the window, and he lifted one bandaged hand to touch the inside pocket of his coat exactly the gesture of someone checking to make sure something was still where it belonged. Then he lowered his hand again. At the 18th minute, another car turned onto the Seaport Street, its headlights sweeping through the falling snow, and pulled to a stop behind them. The woman who stepped out of the car behind them was Rosalind Pike, 50 years old, the chief executive officer of Ash Grove Hospitality, the corporation that owned 17 restaurants and 4 hotels along the New England coast. She wore a long coat thrown hurriedly over the clothes she had been wearing at home, her hair not even tied back yet, and she moved quickly through the snow. In her mind, she had already prepared 3 possible explanations for a phone call at 10 o'clock at night, and none of those 3 possibilities looked anything like what she found when she arrived. She saw the black car parked tight against the curb in front of Aurelia. She saw the rear door open, and the first person to step out was a 34-year-old man in a black shirt, without a coat, standing in the snow. Rosalind Pike stopped short in the middle of the sidewalk. The color drained from her face. She said his name, and she said it in the voice of someone who had just realized that this evening wasn't going to end the way she had expected. Cormac Devlin nodded to her. He said he was sorry for calling so late. Then he turned and walked back into the restaurant, and Rosalind Pike followed him inside. Preston Vale was standing at the host's stand, giving instructions to the 2 security guards. He saw Rosalind first, and relief spread across his face, because his direct superior had arrived, and he already had an entire story prepared for her. He stepped forward and began explaining. He said there had been a minor incident involving an employee who violated the rules concerning the rear entrance, that he had dealt with it decisively, and he added that an unidentified guest had interfered in an internal staff matter, so he had been forced to ask him to leave. Rosalind Pike wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the man standing beside her. Preston noticed that for the first time, and his sentence stopped halfway through. Rosalind turned to him and asked whether he knew who he had just thrown out the door. Preston said he didn't, and his voice had already begun to change. She said the name, Cormac Devlin. Then she said the rest slowly, in the voice of someone reciting something she had known for years, but had never before needed to say aloud. The Devlin Family Investment Fund had held controlling ownership of Ash Grove Hospitality for the past 4 years. Aurelia didn't belong to Ash Grove. Ash Grove merely operated it. The property, the business license, the lease agreements, the payroll for every employee, including Preston Vale's own paycheck, all of it ultimately sat beneath a single signature, and that signature belonged to the man Preston's 2 security guards had just pushed out onto the sidewalk in the middle of a snowstorm. Rosalind added one more sentence, and that was the sentence that made Preston reach for the edge of the counter to steady himself. She told him that table number 9 had been kept empty every Thursday evening for the past 7 weeks, on Mr. Devlin's direct instruction, and that all 3 emails Preston had sent to corporate asking to remove the standing hold had been forwarded directly to him. All 3 of them. Preston Vale stood motionless. Then he began pleading. He said he hadn't known. He said if he had known, everything would have been different. He said he had only been enforcing policy, that the employee really had violated the rules, that he had a family, that he had a loan, that he had spent 20 years in this industry, climbing to the position he held today. He spoke quickly and at length, and the more he spoke, the quieter the room became. Cormac Devlin let him finish. He stood there with both arms resting at his sides, and waited until Preston had run out of words. Then he asked a single question. He asked it very softly, so softly that the people at the farthest tables had to lean forward to hear, and because of that, the entire dining room heard him more clearly than they would have heard any shout. He said, "You just made a mother kneel on the floor over a bowl of soup that was going to be thrown away." Then he asked, "What part of that made this place more elegant?" Preston Vale opened his mouth. He couldn't find an answer. Cormac didn't ask a second time. He turned to Rosalind Pike and said he wanted a suspension order issued before he left that evening. Rosalind nodded. She told Preston to hand over his employee badge and his keys. He stood there for several seconds, then removed the badge from his collar, reached into his suit pocket for the key ring, and placed both on the host stand. Among the keys was one smaller than the others, the key to the discard refrigerator, and when it touched the stone surface, Preston stared at it a moment longer than necessary. Rosalind signed the suspension order that Finton Doyle had just printed from the printer at the host stand. The same 2 security guards who had escorted Cormac Devlin out of the restaurant 18 minutes earlier now stood on either side of Preston Vale and walked him outside. No one raised their voice. No one touched anyone. There was only the sound of a pen moving across paper and the glass door closing behind him. The video appeared at 7:12 the next morning. It was 40 seconds long, filmed from the hallway behind the secondary kitchen area, from an angle only employees ever passed through. In those 40 seconds, viewers saw a woman in a black uniform standing in front of a refrigerator, opening a paper container, ladling soup into it, adding bread, placing a portion of beef inside, closing the lid, then pouring a cup of coffee, and carrying everything out of the frame. There was no sound, nothing before it, nothing after it. No snowstorm, no awning, no 71-year-old man sitting outside in temperatures below freezing. Just 40 seconds of a restaurant employee putting food into a container. The caption underneath said that this was an Aurelia employee who had been caught stealing food and had been fired the night before, then asked viewers what they thought about the kind of people upscale restaurants were hiring these days. The account that posted it had no profile picture, had been created 9 days earlier, and contained no other posts. By 9 o'clock that morning, the video had been shared more than 8,000 times. By noon, 3 local news pages had reposted it, and one of the 3 kept the original caption exactly as it was. Delaney Marsh found out just before 10 o'clock, when her phone began vibrating continuously with calls from numbers she had never seen before. She opened the video and watched it exactly once. She immediately recognized where the camera had been positioned, and she knew precisely what part had been cut out. She sat on the edge of the bed in the 3rd-floor apartment on Sumner Street and watched herself ladling soup into a paper container, and she understood that there was no way to explain this to anyone with words alone. The first call came from her landlord. He didn't shout. He said he had seen the video, that he owned 11 apartments in the building and didn't want any trouble, and that his attorney would be filing a request to move the hearing to an earlier date. Delaney asked how much earlier. He said as soon as possible. Then he hung up. The second call came early that afternoon from the Pediatric Cardiology Program Coordination Office. The woman with the kind voice said she was very sorry to be calling at a time like this. She said Nell Marsh's file was currently being reviewed for scheduling, and according to procedure, the family needed to submit confirmation of stable housing within 10 days, because the child would need to be monitored at home during recovery, and the hospital couldn't schedule the procedure while those living arrangements remained uncertain. She said that if the 10-day deadline passed, the file would be moved to the next review cycle. Delaney asked when the next review cycle would be. The woman was silent for a moment, then said she couldn't give her an exact answer. Delaney thanked her, ended the call, and sat motionless in that room for a very long time. She looked toward the refrigerator door, where the calendar was still held in place by 4 fruit-shaped magnets, and today's square already had a cross through it, drawn by the hand of a 6-year-old girl early that morning, before she went across the hall to Mrs. Corrigan's apartment, 16 days until her birthday. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Delaney went downstairs. She sat on the concrete step at the 2nd-floor landing, the place where she could look through the frosted glass of the hallway window. She turned off her phone, then she opened the address book in her mind and began going through every name in it. She thought of Chef Halverson, then remembered that he worked at Aurelia too. She thought of her 2 closest co-workers, then remembered that both of them were scheduled for the evening shift and that both had watched her kneel on the stone floor. She thought of her former mother-in-law in Worcester, who hadn't called her once since Ronan's funeral. She thought of the free legal aid attorney at the community center, the one who had told her only the week before that the most important thing was to keep her record clean. She thought of Mrs. Corrigan, and she stayed on that name the longest, then pushed it away because Mrs. Corrigan was the only person who still watched Nell for her, and Delaney couldn't bear to let her hear about this from Delaney's own mouth. The list ended there. Delaney Marsh sat on the cold concrete step with both arms wrapped around her elbows, and she realized that she was 27 years old. She had a daughter counting down the days to her birthday on a calendar stuck to the refrigerator, and in the whole city of Boston, at that exact moment, she didn't know who she could call. Rosalind Pike ordered the audit to begin at 8 o'clock Friday morning, exactly 6 days earlier than the scheduled review. The audit team brought reconciliation records from 3 seafood suppliers and placed them beside the blue-covered ledger. Over 7 weeks, the discarded goods total at the Seaport branch had been 3.5 times higher than the average across all 17 restaurants in the system. But that wasn't the number that made everyone in the room fall silent. What did was the security footage from the camera covering the secondary kitchen area. Over those 7 weeks, the camera recorded the discard refrigerator being opened 31 times after midnight, when the restaurant had already closed and only one person remained in the kitchen. 31 times, the same person, the same small key he carried separately in the pocket of his suit jacket. And that very camera system, the one Preston Vale had personally requested, be upgraded during his 2nd week as manager, in order, as he had written in the proposal, to tighten control over inventory loss had captured the entire 11 minutes from Thursday night. All 11 minutes. The man sitting beneath the awning in the snowstorm, the door opening, the paper container being filled from the discard tray, the cloth napkin spread across his lap, and everything that happened afterward on the granite floor. Ashgrove released the full 11-minute recording on Saturday afternoon, uncut, without music, without a single line of added commentary. By evening, the 40-second clip was dead. People took it down, apologized, and began sharing the complete version instead. By Sunday morning, all 3 local news pages had reposted the full footage, and this time the caption said something entirely different. Delaney Marsh was cleared by the very system Preston Vale had installed to protect himself. His file was forwarded to city investigators along with a copy of the blue-covered ledger, the list of deliveries that had stopped on Northern Avenue, and the name of a man at the fish market. On Sunday afternoon, 4 people sat together in a small conference room on the 3rd floor of the hotel. Cormac Devlin, Fintan Doyle, Delaney Marsh, and Emmett Shaw. The old man had showered and was wearing dry clothes, but his hands were still wrapped in bandages the same way as before. Cormac asked him one question. He asked why, on Thursday night, Emmett had said he had the wrong man. Emmett Shaw remained silent for quite a while. Then he said he hadn't been mistaken. He said he had recognized Cormac from the very first week. Everyone in the room turned to look at him. He said that 6 weeks earlier, he had been sleeping somewhere else, 3 blocks away, a place that was better sheltered from the wind and closer to a soup kitchen. Then one evening, he walked past Seaport Street and looked through the side window of the restaurant, and he saw a man sitting at the table by the window. He said he had stood outside for a long time that night. He said he recognized the boy from the scar along his jaw, the one Emmett himself had bandaged when the boy was 10 years old. From that night on, he moved to the alley behind Aurelia. 6 weeks. Not because the awning protected him from the wind, because it didn't protect him from the wind at all, but because every Thursday evening, at exactly 7:15, he could stand at one corner beside the building and see the boy who had once lain flat on his back on an old mat, now sitting at the finest table in Boston, wearing a clean sweater, sitting straight, alive. Cormac asked why he had never come inside. Emmett Shaw looked at him, and his voice didn't tremble at all. He said, "I didn't want to become the price you had to pay." He said he had already seen enough. He said the only thing he needed to know was whether the boy had grown up to live decently, and now he knew, and that was enough for a 71-year-old man. Cormac Devlin couldn't speak for about 10 seconds. Delaney saw him lift a hand to cover his mouth and turn his face away. Then Fintan Doyle opened the leather briefcase and placed a file on the table. He said he had asked someone to look into the Bowdoin Street property records the previous morning. The building was still sealed, and 10 years of unpaid property taxes plus interest now came to more than $40,000. But the land beneath it, after 20 years of redevelopment in Dorchester, after the subway line had been extended by 2 more stops and 3 new apartment buildings had gone up within roughly a quarter mile, now carried a market valuation of $480,000. Emmett Shaw looked up. He asked Fintan to repeat the number. Fintan read it again. The old man sat completely still, both bandaged hands resting on the tabletop, and the most surprised person in that room was Emmett himself. He said that for 10 years, he had believed the paper was nothing more than a piece of paper. He said he had kept it because the address of the gym was written on it, and because he had never known where to throw it away. Then Emmett Shaw reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, yellow with age, soft along the creases from having been folded and unfolded too many times over 10 years. He placed it on the table and smoothed it flat. He said he wanted to sign. Cormac told him he didn't have to do anything, that Cormac would pay the taxes and give the gym back to him, and that was all there was to it. Emmett shook his head. He said he had heard everything about the girl sitting at the other end of the table. He said he would sign, he would sell, on exactly one condition, and he stated that condition in the voice of a man who had no intention of negotiating. Emmett Shaw's condition was only one sentence. Every dollar from the sale of the property, without a single cent missing, was to be transferred directly to the hospital in the name of a 6-year-old girl named Nell Marsh. Delaney shot to her feet. She said no. She said he couldn't do that. That place was his. It was everything he had left. Emmett Shaw remained seated, his bandaged hands resting on the paper he had smoothed flat, and he said he had already lived 71 years, that he had spent more than 20 of them standing inside a room doing exactly what he wanted to do with his life, and that he didn't need anything more. He said he had carried that piece of paper for 10 years, without it being good for anything at all, and now it could finally do one thing, so he was going to sign. 9 days later, The hospital called Delaney Marsh to tell her that the entire out-of-pocket portion had been paid in full, and that Nell's file had been moved onto the priority scheduling list. Delaney stood in the hospital hallway with the phone still in her hand and turned toward the man standing beside her to thank him. Cormac Devlin shook his head. He didn't say anything. He only looked toward the row of chairs at the far end of the hallway, where an old man in a new coat was sitting with a paper cup of coffee in his hand. Emmett Shaw looked up, saw the two of them watching him, and shrugged. He said, "I've got a place to sleep now. The little girl doesn't have what she needs yet." The following week, Rosalind Pike invited Delaney back to Aurelia with a new title and a new salary. Delaney came. She walked to the entrance of the dining room, stood in the doorway, looked at the granite floor shining beneath the lights, and couldn't make herself step inside. She stood there for about half a minute, then took one step backward and said she was sorry. Rosalind Pike didn't ask another question. She simply said she understood, and then told Delaney there was something else. 3 weeks later, Delaney Marsh took charge of a new Ashgrove program that collected every untouched meal from all 17 restaurants in the system and delivered them to shelters throughout Boston every night. Her salary was twice what she had earned before. Full insurance covered both her and her daughter, and she received written confirmation of long-term employment that she carried with her to Suffolk County Housing Court on the exact day of her hearing. The employee policies across the entire company were rewritten that quarter. The rule concerning the rear entrance was revised, and an emergency assistance fund was established for employees facing sudden crises. The small table hidden behind the wood-paneled column, the table with no number and no place on the reservation chart, was given a small brass plaque engraved with 2 words, Shaw's Table. It was always kept empty, and every evening the kitchen still prepared one meal and placed it there. Nell's heart procedure took place on an early April morning and went beautifully. The following afternoon, she was able to sit up, and the first thing she did was ask her mother whether the hospital had pancakes, because she had heard that hospitals were supposed to have pancakes. The second thing she did was complain that the box of crayons they had given her was missing green, exactly like the old box at Mrs. Corrigan's house. And she asked why nobody in the whole world ever bothered to put enough green crayons in a box. Delaney Marsh burst out laughing before she had even finished wiping away her tears, and she told her daughter that she would buy them, both kinds, dark green and light green, because she had promised. 6 months later, the gym on Bowden Street opened its doors again. The boards nailed across the entrance were removed, the walls were repainted, 2 new heavy bags were installed, and the old mat was left exactly where it was, because Emmett Shaw insisted on keeping it. On opening afternoon, the gym was filled with neighborhood children, and in the middle of the floor stood a 6.5-year-old girl wearing boxing gloves 3 times the size of her hands, running around and laughing while the old man beside her counted the rhythm and reminded her to keep breathing. The entire room laughed with her every time she managed to hit the heavy bag and turned around to make sure her mother had seen it. Cormac Devlin stood in the doorway watching. Delaney Marsh stood beside him. She said she still remembered the feeling of the cold stone floor beneath her knees, and she thought she would remember it for the rest of her life. But not because it had been the worst moment of her life. It was because a few seconds later, an old man who had nothing in his hands had knelt down beside her, and a man who had nothing to prove to anyone had stood up. Preston Vale had believed that power was the ability to make other people bow down. Cormac Devlin proved that real power was the ability to help someone stand again. But the man who taught them both those lessons was the one who owned nothing at all, because he understood something both of them had forgotten, that giving, when you have more than enough, is only courtesy, but giving when you have nothing left is what makes us truly human. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can continue listening together to more compelling stories every day. How did you feel about the story of Delaney and Mr. Shaw? Please leave a comment below, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.